Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth of five lectures in the Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Family Lecture Series. I'm Michael Schill, and I'm the Dean of the University of Chicago Law School, and I'm really delighted to be here to introduce Larry Lessig. I know that many of you have attended the first three lectures in this extraordinary series, so you already know about the very long relationship between the University of Chicago Law School and our speaker today, Larry Lessig. Larry's biography has been covered in the other introductions to the previous talks, so today I'm going to introduce him by telling you something about Larry as a young academic here at the University of Chicago, which is, I think, especially relevant for our talk today. So Larry joined the law school faculty in 1991, fresh off his clerkships with our faculty member, Judge Richard Posner, and our former faculty member, Justice Antonin Scalia. Now, having those two names on one's resume really does establish in a very strong way one's bona fides with respect to an academic career. But of course, at this university, fancy pedigrees really lose their luster very quickly. As Larry will no doubt attest, at Chicago, you are only as good as your newest idea, something that we all learn when we come here. And Larry has never, ever lacked for new and interesting and wonderful new ideas. Now, when I meet alumni at the law school, I frequently ask them about their memorable professors. Now, when those of you who are students graduate, you know, this is a trick. We want to get you all warm and fuzzy inside by thinking about memorable, wonderful professors, and then we ask you for money. Larry's name frequently comes up. Sometimes our graduates mention his uniforms of dark pants and blue shirts, occasionally punctuated by a white shirt, but more often they describe someone with amazing creativity and insight. Indeed, one person described it as Larry's world. Now, even in his early days as an academic, Larry demonstrated three characteristics: a desire to speak truth to power, excitement at biting off way more than any normal mortal can do, or can chew rather, and then constant examination and re-examination in the service of improvement of both himself and the world. So in 1996, one of our student journals, the University of Chicago Law Forum, put on a symposium called The Law of Cyberspace. The field, such as it was so new that it was actually still being referred to as cyber law. And interestingly, the word internet doesn't even appear in the titles of all the articles at the symposium. So at the symposium, Judge Frank Easterbrook gave a talk called Cyberspace and the Law of the Horse. Now, I'm told that Frank was quite dismissive in his paper of the idea that there was a law, and Larry's nodding, that there was a law of cyberspace at all. Instead, Frank thought, create general rules, apply them everywhere, including cyberspace. Now, this notion was influential at the time, and Frank himself was as influential then as he is now. Larry had just gotten tenure and had been in his early career purely a scholar of constitutional law. His published works were mostly about presidential power and the Eastern European constitutions. But Larry, before anyone else on the law school's faculty, and almost before anyone else in the academy, had seen the future. By the time of the symposium, he had started to think seriously about this new frontier, the frontier of the internet, and published an article called The Law of Cyber Law, The Path of Cyber Law, in 1995. The potential size of this field didn't bother him. The fact that it was a great deal different from anything he had ever done before was not daunting to him. In other words, Larry is the quintessential Chicago law scholar. This field was interesting to him, and it had the potential to change the world, so he just dove in with both feet. And when Frank Easterbrook, a giant of the judiciary, an imposing figure, A veteran not only of Larry's home faculty, but also the court in which he clerked, said that this field wasn't a field of all. Larry did what Larry does. He brilliantly, eloquently, and as it turns out, pretty much correctly answered back. The resulting articles in his very first book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, made him an academic superstar. And we've seen him do this more than once. Take on the establishment and go big, very, very big. Areas such as intellectual property, also net neutrality, sexual abuse of minors, and political corruption, just to name a few. Larry's commitment to education, the subject of tonight's talk, is also evident from his very first days at the law school. Through hard work, Larry became an extraordinary teacher. These qualities, these three qualities, speaking truth to power, a willingness to take on huge, huge fields and problems, and using his gifts to improve everything he can, are all being brought into sharp relief at these Berlin family lectures. Today, Larry's specific focus is on us, academia. I, for one, am greatly anticipating what he has to say, and I'd like to introduce to you Larry Lessig.
Thank you, Dean. I think I want to stop because that was fantastic and nothing after that could match it, certainly by me. But my objective is to talk about the Academy. I dressed for the occasion, as you can see. But to introduce the topic, I want to wind together some of the themes that we've seen so far as an introduction to what I expect this lecture will contribute. So, as I've described it, institutional corruption is an influence within an economy of influence that weakens the effectiveness of an institution, especially by weakening public trust of that institution. And one example, what I called the paradigm example in my first talk, was the institutional corruption that could come from an improper dependence. That was lecture 1. And in that lecture, I described the dependence that this institution has developed, a dependence upon its funders, the funders of campaigns, and the way in which that dependence conflicts with the dependence that Madison at least promised, a dependence upon the people alone. So that conflict in dependencies produces an institution that has weakening public trust because the public looks at this institution and believes it's acting not in the interest of the people, but in the interest of its funders. And in the way that I described, borrowing from Francis Fukuyama, it weakens the effectiveness of the institution because it's created a radically unstable Congress that can't address issues because of the way small factions can block any transformation. But in that definition, I said that there's an ambiguity in the idea of what effectiveness would be. And what I described was effectiveness relative to a particular purpose. And that meant we had to identify the purpose of an institution before we could know whether it was institutionally corrupt. And I developed that idea in the context of a discussion of finance in lecture 2. And the opening question in that lecture was, did finance have a purpose? A purpose, a public purpose, that could provide the baseline against which we might say corruption has weakened the institution or weakened public trust of the institution. Some purpose beyond the private purpose of simply making money. And so in the context of rating agencies, I suggested, yes, there was a public purpose that we could say had been corrupted by the way the rating agencies had allowed their influences to develop. But in the context of banks, I was more uncertain. There was at least a question whether private banks in this context had a public purpose that we could say was corrupted. But those two contexts drove to a question which was the focus of what I described in my third lecture. How could we support a public purpose if we saw the institution deviating from what those within the field believe its public interest should be? So I introduced in that lecture, in lecture 3, this distinction between a purpose being produced as a byproduct of the way an institution was designed, or the purpose being imposed through norms that layered on top of the structure of the institution as it was designed. And these norms, I suggested, in the context of discussing media, were going to be dependent on the context, the technical context, in that context of media. And so one particular norm which I raised in order to question when talking about media was the norm that journalists or institutions of journalism needed to be nonpartisan. And the question that I asked really suggested as a question, because I'm not confident that the answer to this question should be any different from what we ordinarily believe it to be. But the question I raised was whether nonpartisanship, in the context of the currently massively competitive infrastructure of news and journalism, wasn't actually inverting the objective of journalism by distancing people from an understanding of the issues which at least political journalism are supposed to develop. And so the effectiveness of the institution would have been weakened by maintaining this focus on a purpose which, as I suggested, possibly the context had rendered obsolete. Okay, in this lecture, in the lecture of the Academy, I focus on one final corner of this definition, what we think of as influence within an economy of influence. And to introduce this idea, I want to tell a story. You could think of it as a tale of two cities, but I want to tell a tale of two professions. So the first profession I want to describe is the profession of medicine. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this extraordinary book by Paul Starr, Social Transformation of American Medicine, which tells the story of American medicine becoming what we think of medicine today to be. And it's really hard for us to recognize just how different medicine as a profession was for most of the history of the United States. For much of the 19th century, doctors were really quite ordinary members of our society. There was no medical elite for them to be members of. Medicine was divided among these different sects, homeopathy, for example, being a raging and powerful minority sect. And the field was filled with cranks and wizards selling snake oil. As Jennifer Washburn puts it in her fantastic book, University Inc., which I'm going to return to later, this is a field of quacks selling nostrums or folk healers selling herbs. But as Paul Starr describes it, medicine recognized by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that they needed to assure the public of the reliability of their product. And that required them to answer a fundamental question in the minds of most people by the end of the 19th century. Really, what sort of commodity was medical care? So the profession adopted a certain kind of strategy. The strategy was to convince the public that this was a case of private actors actually providing a public good, doctors, through their private interest providing this public good of health care. And physicians decided that the most effective way for them to build up their public credibility was to make clear that it was their medical decisions that were guided by science and expertise and not by narrow commercial interests. And what this required is that they build the profession to sustain the autonomy of doctors within the profession, or we could say the independence of doctors within the profession. And doctors knew, as they were developing this profession, that if they failed to gain their own professional autonomy, they risked becoming, as Jennifer Washburn puts it, mere hired hands or contract physicians to private industry. Because by the end of the 19th century, there were alternative models developing for how doctors might actually be employed. company doctors or corporate doctors, doctors working for large institutions, just the way millers began to work for large institutions as the production of milling material would change. And then potentially, far worse, third parties, somebody other than doctors, would exert control over their medical decisions. So their objective was to avoid this terrible outcome, and their technique, one might say their trick, was to develop codes of conduct in medicine that were higher than the minimal rules that were then governing the marketplace. And what inspired, really quite dramatically, the development of those codes was an incredible report produced by Abraham Flexner that exposed the fraud in the marketing of many medical schools across the country, describing lecture halls with no equipment, with reeking corpses, theaters that hadn't been disinfected. And then armed with Flexner's report, the AMA succeeded in winning widespread state support for the implementation of stricter accreditation standards for medical schools and eventually for medicine itself. And so that the sovereignty over medical care had been preserved within the control of the doctors through, as Washburn puts it, the banishment of profit-making business from medical practice itself. Okay, here at Chicago, the reaction to that story is to say, oh, come on, wait a minute. This is a guild. They are conspiring to raise prices. That's all that's going on here. And of course it is. Of course it's a guild conspiring to raise their own prices. But here's the point. The technique which they adopt is a technique to preserve their own independence. And through the decentralized structure of many, many doctors with this independent authority, they could preserve the objective of producing this public good, independent medical care, as a byproduct of their own private good, their conspiracy to raise medical prices. Okay, that's the first profession. I want to contrast that profession with profession number 2, psychiatry. And here's a story which I can't tell by pointing to a great book by Paul Starr that's been published for more than 20 years, 20-some years. Instead, I have to point to a book that will be coming out next year, a really incredible book by 2 colleagues of mine at the Safra Center, Robert Whitaker and Lisa Cosgrove, Psychiatry Under the Influence. So Whitaker and Cosgrove tell a similar story about psychiatry because they're describing a profession that has a similar need, a profession in need of an identity, a purpose, a public understanding that ratifies its role or necessity within society. Because as the influence of this great man began to fade, and people were no longer convinced that it was just about working out some weird relation with your mother that you needed to do in order to deal with different psychological maladies, there was an urgent need to figure out what would replace that conception. And the American Psychiatric Association quickly realized it needed a transformation in what the public understood psychiatry to be. The old view, described by Whitaker and Cosgrove, was that anxiety, depression, and even psychosis were not to be seen as symptoms of a disease, but rather emotional distress that arose from internal psychological conflicts and the particulars of a person's life story. But the problem with that old view was the problem of reliability. There was a question of whether doctors trained in that old view could reliably diagnose and treat a wide range of patients who presented symptoms that were to be related to the, quote, diseases from this old view. Very famously, in 1973, David Rosenhan, a Stanford professor, conducted an experiment. He and 7 students showed up at 12 different mental hospitals. Wikipedia tells us this is one of those hospitals, now closed down. And they complained when they showed up of hearing voices in their head. All 8 of them said they had these vague sounds saying things like thud or empty or hollow. And these were the only symptoms they presented. And in every case, the students were admitted to the mental hospitals. In all of 1 cases, they were diagnosed as having schizophrenia. Once they were admitted to the hospitals, they all stopped displaying any of these symptoms, but it didn't change the diagnosis of the doctors in the hospitals. The only people who recognized that this was a trick or a joke were the other patients in the hospitals. They figured it out, but the doctors didn't. And after this story was revealed, Rosenhan said, "We have known for a long time that diagnoses are often not useful or reliable, but we have nevertheless continued to use them. We now know that we cannot distinguish insanity from sanity." So the urgent need to find a conception of psychiatry that the public would respond to was described by the APA as the profession living under siege and facing, as Whitaker and Cosgrove put it, a threat of, quote, extinction. And to the rescue came an extraordinary doctor, Robert Spitzer. And Spitzer led a project to revive a diagnostic procedure through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, would eventually become DSM-3, to be a scientific process for identifying who had what diseases. And this was to be, as Spitzer described, a defense of the medical model as applied to psychiatric problems, and a massive, at least potentially scientifically based tool for identifying and dealing with what was obviously a huge social problem, mental disorders, but dealing with them as, quote, mental disease. Because this was the key. Disorders were not the product of what happened to your mom or a certain fixation with whatever. Freud was out. Disorders were to become diseases. And as described by Whitaker and Cosgrove, the biological faction had emerged triumphant in this battle. What was being described now were problems with the brain, not with experiences in your life. And as the APA leadership quickly told its members, they needed to put aside the past philosophical differences. As the APA medical director, Melvin Sabshin, put it, "It's time to state forcefully that the identity crisis is over." I found if you try to state forcefully that your identity crisis is over, it doesn't quite work. But anyway, that's what they tried to do. As the American Journal of Psychiatry put it, it was important for the field to, quote, speak with a united voice, not only to secure the support of the public, but, quote, to buttress psychiatry's position against the numerous other mental health professionals seeking patience and prestige. This is exactly the same fight that medicine went through as they were fighting the homeopaths and the others. And so the APA develops the Division of Publications and Marketing within the organization to, quote, improve the public perceptions of psychiatry and to deepen the medical identification of psychiatrists in the minds of the public. The public was to understand them as doctors for the brain. Now, of course, all this process, of course, costs a lot of money. So the question was, where was the APA going to get that money? And the answer, of course, was drug companies. And beginning in the 1970s, they start taking lots of money from drug companies. And early on in this process, the APA board is a little bit troubled by this. The board, according to the minutes of the board meeting, asked the question whether the APA's relationships with pharmaceutical companies were going beyond the bounds of professionalism and were compromising our principles. Great question. So they appointed a task force. And the task force objective was to answer the question, how dependent had the APA become on industry? And the conclusion of that task force was very dependent. But the task force went on to observe that if they rejected the dependency, then the APA would have to shrink. And the response there was, rather than to curtail the relationship with pharmaceuticals, they would expand their relationship with pharmaceutical companies. Grants increased from pharmaceutical companies. They voted to encourage pharmaceutical companies to support scientific or other cultural activities rather than strictly social activities at the annual APA board meetings. And of course, the drug firms jumped at the chance, as Whitaker and Cosgrove put it, to help fund more of the APA's activity. The APA, as they put it, found that it could turn to pharmaceutical companies for money to fund its public affairs campaigns, its political lobbying efforts, and other special projects. But of course, as this happened, the concern in the profession grows too. As Fred Gottlieb, who was the speaker of the APA, put it, my own concern about the need for even more carefully looking at our continuing dependence on outside funds, it is my own concern. He said, I do not suggest that either they or we are evil folks, but I continue to believe that accepting such money is in the long run inimical to our independent functioning. We have evolved a somewhat casual and quite cordial relationship with the drug houses. We seem to discount available data that drug advertising promotes irrational prescribing practices. We seem to think that we as psychiatrists are immune from the kinds of unconscious emotional bias in favor of those who are overtly friendly towards us. We apparently assume we are too wise to suppress cognitively dissonant information. We persist, he said, in ignoring an inherent conflict of interest. And it wasn't just within the APA. Matthew Dumont, in 1980, complained of the industry and the APA being, quote, in bed together. Lauren Mosher, former head of schizophrenia studies at the NIMH, resigned from the APA, calling it an institution that had evolved into the American Psychopharmacological Association, not the American Psychiatric Association. And even a senator, Grassley, commented, I have come to understand that money from pharmaceutical industry can shape the practices of nonprofit organizations that purport to be independent of their viewpoints and actions, which of course forces me to include the hello pot, meet the kettle meme. Okay, so you can look at this and say, so what? So what? Who cares about this relationship of the APA to drug companies? And the answer is its effect on the DSM. Because the APA, of course, is the owner of the DSM and the process for developing the DSM. And the DSM, of course, was born from this clear scientific impulse to make diagnoses scientifically valid, based on objective criteria, which you could validate by looking at the way doctors looked at patients across the country and actually figure out whether the categories were actually in fact used consistently. But in fact, the DSM did not translate into a rigorous scientific process. Early on, they gave up the objective of doing this project scientifically. Samuel Goose was a professor at Wash U in St. Louis, who developed some of the original tests for validating diagnoses, proposed a standard for the DSM, which would be that they could have no diagnoses, they could have no disease, unless there was actually data to support the idea that you could reliably and in a valid way rely on people diagnosing the same people with the same kind of disease. That idea was rejected by the APA, and as he reports in an interview, the response to him was, if we do what you are proposing, which makes sense to us scientifically, we think that not only will we weaken what we are trying to do, but we will have given the insurance companies an excuse not to pay us. So these standards were actually not validated. In 2012, as Whitaker and Cosgrove describe, a 2012 roundtable discussion of the DSM with more than 20 experts in psychiatric diagnostics led moderator Yale Medical School psychiatrist James Phillips to conclude that virtually all discussants agreed that most of the diagnoses fail the test of the original validators. And Phillips went on, the startling failure of research to validate the DSM categories has led to a conceptual crisis in our nosology. What exactly is the status of DSM diagnoses? Do they identify real diseases, or are they merely convenient and at times arbitrary ways of grouping psychiatric symptoms? And then Nasser Ghaemi, professor at Tufts, said these leaders of the DSMs don't believe there are scientific truths in psychiatric diagnoses, only mutually agreed upon falsehoods. They call it reliability. So here was a process unvalidated, yet what it did was produce 265 disorders. 265 disorders. Now that's important because if you've got a disorder, there's something an insurance company will pay for. And since these disorders were diseases, now we had a target for drugs. Every disorder was a potential new drug. And as the authors comment, while this was not a result that motivated Spitzer's remaking of the DSM, the new manual nevertheless provided pharmaceutical companies with a way to dramatically expand the market for their products. And as Spitzer commented later in his life, the pharmaceuticals were delighted at this consequence from their strategy. And why wouldn't they be? Because in fact, there was a clear business model implied from this process of developing the DSM. Drug companies could provide the financial resources for the task of developing the DSM, while academic psychiatry and the APA provided medical legitimacy. And the growth continued through these different editions. The growth of the number of diseases or disorders continued through these editions. So in 1994, an estimate was made that 26.2% of America was ill with one of the disorders that had been identified in the latest DSM, that was DSM-4. And societal spending on psychiatric drugs increased from approximately $800 million in 1987 to $35 billion in 2010. Today, 1 in 5 Americans is taking a psychotropic drug. Okay, so you say, so what? Again, so what, right? If science supports it, then what we're doing is just helping patients. Nobody would complain if we said aspirin was now available to everybody, whereas before it wasn't. We've just increased the amount of drugs that are available in the market to deal with problems in the market. This is what we call progress, not corruption. But the problem is the gap between scientific truth and the APA's marketing, because there's a growing difference between what the scientists say, what the academic community increasingly says, and what the position of the APA is on fundamental issues of mental health. Let me just take one example that is described extensively in the book, the so-called chemical imbalance theory of mental disorder. Now, if you look at the marketing story, this is something the APA is quite sensitive about. Tufts professor Ronald Pies, who was editor of the APA's newspaper, the Psychiatric Times, when asked about this chemical imbalance theory, said the following, "I am not one who easily loses his temper, but I confess to experiencing markedly increased limbic activity whenever I hear someone proclaim psychiatrists think all mental disorders are due to a chemical imbalance." He goes on, "In the past 30 years, I don't believe I have ever heard a knowledgeable, well-trained psychiatrist make such a preposterous claim, except perhaps to mock it." Okay, that's 2011. Here's 2001, the APA president, Richard Harding. "In the last decade, neuroscience and psychiatric research has begun to unlock the brain's secrets. We now know that mental illness, such as depression or schizophrenia, are not moral weaknesses or imagined, but real diseases caused by abnormalities of brain structure and imbalance of chemicals in the brain." In 2005, the APA issued this press release, proudly declaring that 75% of consumers now believe that mental illnesses are usually caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. In the same year, they released this Let's Talk Facts About Depression booklet that said antidepressants may be prescribed to correct imbalances in the level of chemicals in the brain. And they were proud to report in 2006 that 87% of Americans thought schizophrenia was because of chemical imbalances, and 80% of Americans thought that was true of depression as well. The reality is we are all believers of the chemical imbalance theory because of a campaign which they have participated in promulgating across the last 20 years of our history. But here's the scientific fact. It's just not true that mental disorders come from such a chemical imbalance. As Whitaker and Cosgrove put it, the chemical imbalance theory has been investigated and found to be wanting. Stephen Stahl, in his textbook, says there's no clear and convincing evidence that chemical imbalance accounts for depression. That is, there is no real chemical imbalance. Ken Kendler, co-editor-in-chief of Psychological Medicine, said, we have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for psychiatric disorders and not found them. So the theory which was promoted is not the theory that scientists operate under, which is again why we saw at the beginning the APA's spokesman was so adamant to say, of course, we never believed such a crazy theory was true. But why is it so important then that the public believe such a crazy theory is true? Well, if it's a chemical imbalance, then we have a reason for a drug. And if there are many such imbalances, then we have reasons for lots of drugs. So why then is there the gap between the science and the marketing? Well, I can't say completely why there's such a gap, but here's one thing we can say. As Cosgrove and Whitaker put it, many of the authors of the DSM manuals, as they drew up these diagnostic boundaries, had financial ties to the industry. 56% of all the panel members for DSM-4 had ties to the industry. 100% of the panel members for mood disorders, 100% for schizophrenia disorders, 81% for anxiety disorders. The people deciding what the categories are have financial ties to the industry that benefits from those categories. Now, in the story of their book, which I can't tell more of here, and I urge you when the book comes out to look at, the story of this book is troubling with respect to the APA, but it's not the most troubling part. It's not the worst part of the story. Much worse in this story is the way the particular diseases such as depression, ADHD, anxiety, depression in kids, have been described and diagnosed and promoted over the history of modern psychiatry. There's a common pattern which they document in the book. Weak research, which is misleadingly promoted, and it's later discovered the flaw in the earlier research, and that flaw forces people to question the diagnoses or the recommendation for drugs to deal with the diagnoses in every one of those cases. And in every case where this is discovered, the mistakes correlate with the financial interests of the people making the mistakes. Correlates. Does it cause? I don't know. It correlates, which is the troubling dynamic which the book is describing. So here's a profession with a guild interest too. But the point is, unlike medicine, they advance their guild interest by developing independence, by introducing independence. Psychiatry would rise or fall as a function of what pharmaceutical companies were able to do. It's not just that they were in bed with, they were chained to pharmaceutical companies. And the problem with that for psychiatry is that, of course, pharmaceutical companies have gone from being one of the most admired industries to being described by a majority of Americans as dishonest, unethical, and more concerned with profits than with individual and public health. A point the architects of the profession should more carefully have reflected upon. Okay, now, I became an activist focused on institutional corruption on April 22nd, 2008, when I was testifying for the United States Senate about network neutrality issues. And on my phone, I got a text from this man, Senator John Sununu. And Sununu's text was, "You shouldn't be shilling for big internet companies." And my reaction was something like this. Because I thought, holy shit, he thinks I'm being paid to give this testimony. He thinks I've been hired by an internet company to give this testimony. And then I thought, of course he thinks I'm being paid. Because increasingly in that field, everybody's giving paid testimony. just that month, I had an encounter with a colleague who had received $50,000 to write an article about the regulation of cable companies. Of course, it was an article that was against the regulation of cable companies. In his first footnote, he had not mentioned the fact he had been paid to write that article. I wrote him and I said, "You were bragging to me that you were paid $50,000 to write this article. Why didn't you mention it?" He responded, "Oh, I forgot." Forgot to mention it. So it's completely obvious that in that context, Sununu would look at me sitting there. I wasn't wearing a bow tie. I was wearing a more, professionally lobbyist-like outfit, but sitting there arguing in favor of one rule that would benefit one set of industries, to believe that I was acting on behalf of those industries because I was so paid. This was an example of institutional corruption. Institutional corruption asks, does this influence, the influence of people paying people to give public testimony, change the testimony? Or does it change the trust in the testimony? Trust that the testimony is being given because this is what that particular person believes is actually true or in the public interest versus what happens to benefit the client. And the point that I recognized on that day was it clearly changes the trust. The trust, the sort of thing that Paul Starr was talking about as a collective good that the profession of medicine need to develop. That trust was weakened in a context where academics would be understood to be giving what was otherwise purporting to be public interested testimony when they were actually being privately compensated. And it would be perfectly legitimate, I recognized at that moment, for the academy to act in a way to protect the trust which the academics otherwise should be able to offer. They could say something like, you shouldn't be allowed to convert our collective assets, the collective assets of all academics, to your private gain, to trade on the fact that you are a Harvard law professor, or at that time I was a Stanford law professor, in order to get money for yourself. So they could do that. But the question is, should they do that? Should the academy restrict professors in this way? Because if we take the example that I gave you from McClure's when we were talking about media, one question you could ask is, why restrict the professors if the story they're telling is true, if the testimony they're telling is true? Who cares if they're being paid for it or not? And why believe it's not true? What reason is there to believe that at least, people like us, professors at places like Chicago, would be giving testimony that they didn't believe was true? Okay, to answer that, we've got to think a little bit about the context. We're talking about the influence, but recognize there are lots of different influences here. Many different kinds of influences that people within the academy confront. Cases of paid testimony, really the smallest category of cases. Consulting relationships. Medicine develops these whole list of academics called key opinion leaders, who they pay and nurture so that they have views which are consistent with the interest of those who are paying them, and ownership interest in various intellectual property that comes out of the enterprise of being an academic. But maybe the most significant exogenous event that has raised this issue as an important issue for academics to think about was something done by this man. Hard to think he would do anything that would be so harmful, but here it is, Jimmy Carter. We forget, was the person who signed the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980. The Bayh-Dole Act, which said that you could take government money devoted to public research and patent the product of that research for private gain. And the idea was, if we did that, we would encourage many more people to invent great new products. We would give a spur to innovation, because now academics would have an incentive. Because, of course, academics were just sitting around on their duffs before that, doing nothing. But if we could give them money, then they would go out and invent great new ideas, like the internet. Or, wait, that was not patented. Okay, but some new idea I'm sure was patented. So this was the conception. What Bayh-Dole did was introduce a radical change, not just in the legal relation between government-funded research and IP rights, but in the norms of researchers. Because until Bayh-Dole, there had been a very clear rule, as described by Daniel Kevlis, a historian here, quote, knowledge wrestled from nature in universities ought to be bestowed upon the world free of charge, not exploited for profit by the universities. That principle led all major research universities to ban patents coming out of research funded by the university. And the push for this was not just a push because of some communistic idealism, it was instead a certain fear that the activity of patenting work would change the university. This man, Frederick Cottrell, in 1912, was a professor at Berkeley, came up with a fantastic idea for controlling pollution and wanted to commercialize the idea. But decided it was incredibly important to commercialize it outside of Berkeley. He set up the Research Corporation, very important independent institution for facilitating commercialization of such research. And when he was asked why he did that, why not just give Berkeley the ability to commercialize it, his answer was there was a danger involved. A danger was involved, particularly should the experiment prove highly profitable to the university, the experiment of giving the university this resource, and lead to a general emulation of the plan. The danger this suggested was the possibility of growing commercialism and competition between institutions and an accompanying tendency for secrecy in scientific work. Because what he recognized 100 years ago is that if you created a commercial incentive which required secrecy, which is what a patent requires, then you destroy the norm in scientific research to share research openly as it's being developed. As Paul David from Stanford puts it, there's distinctive cultural norms, customs, and reward systems that govern the behavior of scientists who work in these two spheres, one an open science culture, the other the proprietary culture. Cooperative relationships are readily undermined by alternative systems of exchange based on ownership and control of property. They needed to be separate. But as Jennifer Washburn described it, this fact, this point recognized by Cottrell 100 years ago, was completely ignored by Congress as Congress considered and passed the Bayh-Dole Act. She writes, virtually no one who testified during Bayh-Dole hearings bothered to ask any questions about the legislation's potential impact on academic culture, academic freedom, conflicts of interest, or the tradition of open science. And as she argues, this mixing of these two cultures leads to what Thomas Garrity and Wendy Wagner describe as the bending of science. For exactly the same reasons, for exactly the same dynamic that I suggested when I was describing psychiatry. As Washburn puts in her book, Mildred Cho, for example, authored a study in the Annals of Internal Medicine that found 98% of papers based on industry-sponsored research reflected favorably on the drugs being examined, compared with 79% of papers based on research not funded by the industry. This systematic finding has been repeated across a wide range of contexts, with the obvious point being the commercial interest is something we have to worry about if we're worrying about the truth of the underlying research. Now, of course, if money is not provided by private entities, it would be provided by the government, and you could have an equivalent worry with government funding, and indeed there have been criticisms of government funding in the context of certain research. It tends to be politically sensitive. It tends to go towards political direction, much higher research in certain areas than is justified by the risk that it's presenting. But as Washburn describes, there's a long tradition of worrying about that kind of bias and trying to work against it. Vannevar Bush, the original inspiration for much of national NIH-like funding, quotes, assiduously tried to insulate the federal grant-making process from politics by having all grants decided through a meritocratic, competitive, peer-reviewed system. But her point is there's no similar structure with corporate influence. And as she puts it, what all of these examples reveal is that commercial forces are rapidly undermining the delicate foundation of trust that underlies academic medicine. It wasn't always this way. Okay, but how is it doing that? What's the mechanism? Because if we want to assume, which I'm going to assume, that the academic is not a criminal, there are some people who believe that, academics self-consciously make up the data and self-consciously fudge the reports, self-consciously do these wrong things. I'm going to throw all those assumptions away. I'm not assuming that anything that's going on here is contrary to the good will or the wishes of the researcher. If that's true, then how is the work bent? Because the people who know something about the work assume it's bent. There's really fantastic research done, again funded in part by SAFRA. Aaron Kesselheim at the Harvard Medical School did a randomized study of 503 board-certified internists, giving them abstracts designed to describe clinical trials of 3 made-up drugs, hypothetical drugs. And each of these trials had either high, medium, or low methodological rigor, and each reported funding as either not mentioned or coming from the government or coming from private industry. So it was a test to see whether the source of the funding would influence the clinical physician's trust or confidence in the report made about those drugs. And what they found was industry sponsorship reduces the doctor's willingness to believe and act on trial findings independently of the trial's quality, even if it was a gold standard trial, perfectly set up, randomized control process to guarantee the results. The fact that it was funded by the industry led these clinicians to have less trust. So people within the field manifest this lack of trust. And people who assume, they're called economists, understand the way in which this lack of trust could develop. So Chicago's own Luigi Zingales has recently written this fantastic paper, Preventing Economist Capture. And the basic insight that pushes the research here is that economists are constantly focused on how regulators are captured by the targets of their regulation. So he asked the question, why don't we think that economists are similarly captured? Now, of course, economists are people who believe that the only people who don't react to economic incentives in the world are economists. But Luigi thinks that, in fact, they do react to economic incentives. And as he describes early on in the papers, if these are the reasons why regulators are captured, it's not clear why economists are not captured as well. While not all data economists use are proprietary, that's one of the reasons why regulators might be captured. Access to proprietary data provides unique advantage to highly competitive academic markets. To obtain these academic data, academic economists have to develop a reputation to treat the sources nicely. Hence, their incentives to cater to industry or to the political authority that controls the data are similar to those of the regulators. So the academics, with their relationship to the proprietary sources of data, have a similar dynamic, he's saying, to be captured. And then people who understand something about the way this influence works, can think of them as the inventor of this idea of institutional corruption, also have a reason to explain how this bending might occur. Dennis Thompson, who was the first architect of this concept, which I've tried to develop, says that the point is the rules do not assume, rules against conflicts of interest, do not assume that most physicians or researchers let financial gain influence their judgment. They assume only that it is often difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish cases in which financial gain does have an improper influence from those in which it does not. Given this general difficulty of discovering real motives, it is safer and therefore ethically more responsible to decide in advance to remove, insofar as possible, factors that tend to distract us from concentrating on medical and scholarly goals. Okay, but even this conception that lets financial gain influence their judgment assumes something. It assumes that the actors have some control over what's influencing them. It assumes that they're aware and can counter that control. But can we control the influences that are operating on us? Can we actually counter them? Are we even aware of them? Now, in economics, there's a growing school called behavioral economics. In ethics, there's a growing school called behavioral ethics. And like behavioral economics, what behavioral ethics tries to do is look empirically at how people deal with ethical situations and learn something from that empirical observation about what's ethically possible. What are the rules that it's possible for us ethically to observe? And behavioral ethics, like behavioral economics, has a way to categorize different ways in which humans react. So they have two systems, system 1 versus system 2. System 1 is the automatic processes for stimuli that we have, which we act on very quickly. And system 2 is the more slow, reflective, deliberative processes that we engage in if we're reading Rawls's theory of justice or something like that. And the point that the behavioral ethicists make is that, in fact, it's system 1 that controls ethical decisions. We make ethical decisions automatically without even thinking. We don't even know that they're making the ethical decision because it's operating subconsciously. And that means that when we have a reason to reach a certain result, what's called motivated reasoning also uses system 1 reasoning, also automatically drives us to a certain conclusion without us even realizing that that's what we're doing. And that leads some people to say, well, we can solve that by just triggering system 2, giving people a way to know, hey, you might be biased here because, he's giving you a gift of $100. You might want to worry about that, so step back, slow down, reflect a little bit on what this might have done. But what behavioral ethics shows is that when we switch to system 2, we tend to rationalize the conclusion that has come from system 1. In fact, we are more confident about the result because we've now added a layer of reasoning on top of our initial intuitive response. So there's a set of these kinds of reactions. I'm going to go through and describe very quickly some of them that behavioral ethics has developed here. For example, the self-conception bias. And this is described by Tarvis and Aronson. They say, because most people have a reasonably positive self-conception, believing themselves to be confident, believing themselves to be competent, moral, smart, and kind, their efforts at reducing dissonance will be designed to preserve their positive self-images, even when that perpetuates behavior that is incompetent, unethical, foolish, or cruel. They described, using fMRI technology, the way in which the reasoning areas of the brain shut down when somebody is confronted with one of these dissonance moments. You just stop reasoning about it. And that means that they're showing mechanisms to provide a neurological basis for the observation that once our minds are made up, it may be physiologically difficult to change them because we've developed a response that stops us from thinking once we recognize the ethical problem of dissonance. And particularly troubling is that it's worse for good souls, smart people, people who think of themselves as particularly ethical, right? Because, a thief knows he's a thief. There's no ambiguity. He doesn't go through life wondering, am I a good person or not? He knows, no, I'm a thief. But a good person thinks he or she is a good person, which means that the mechanism here operates on the good person in a way that it doesn't operate on the thief. So as they describe, the non-conscious mechanism of self-justification is not the same thing as lying or making excuses to others to save face or save a job. It's more powerful and more dangerous than the explicit lie because it blinds us from even becoming aware that we are wrong about a belief or that we did something foolish, unethical, or cruel. Dissonance theory therefore predicts that it's not only bad people who do bad things, more often the greater problems comes from good people who do bad things or smart people who cling to foolish beliefs precisely to preserve their belief that they are good, smart people. Even highly trusted professionals, as Gary Gray, a scholar from our center, puts it, such as medical doctors, veterinarians, have been known to apply neutralizing techniques in order to excuse unethical or illegal behaviors like medical billing fraud. So there's a psychological mechanism for showing us why, in fact, we won't be aware of the influence in a way that allows us to counter it or to check it. Or there's a kind of obliviousness bias. We know from empirical work that marketing drugs increases the adoption of those drugs by doctors. But we also know doctors believe they're unaffected by the marketing of drug companies. Now here's the obvious point. Both of those claims can't be true. Both can't be true, but we have empirical data to prove the actual result of the marketing, and all we have is the word of the doctors telling us what, in fact, the marketing does to them. Or there's something we call the self-serving rationalization. Sunita Saw and George Lowenstein have been writing about this recently. This is driven from the belief that especially successful people have, especially people who've worked hard for their position, that, I'm worth it, I'm good, I did really hard work to get where I am, that justifies my behavior. So, for example, they did these tests where they were trying to evaluate whether doctors would take what would be considered illegal gifts. And they reminded the doctors in the first version of the test of the burden that they had gone through to get through medical school, the years of hard work at low pay, the suffering that they had been forced to withstand in order to become doctors. And when they reminded them of the burden, the percentage of doctors who took these illegal gifts went from 22% to 48%. And then they tried a different version, where it wasn't just, indirectly suggesting that it's worth it, you're justified because you've worked so hard. They gave them an explicit rationalization, an explicit reason why it was okay to break the rule. And then the number went from 22% to 60% of the doctors who took this illegal gift. And what they conclude is that this implies that rationalizations rejected on a conscious level can nonetheless help us unconsciously rationalize questionable behavior, because the doctors who relied on the rationalization also said that the rationalization was a bad rationalization. They thought it was an insufficient justification for actually breaking the rule. Yet, they acted on the insufficient justification and broke the rule more than they otherwise would have. Or most importantly, of course, is the implicit reciprocity norm, which, of course, as humans, all of us have. When somebody does something nice to you, you learn to respond in a reciprocal way. If you don't, you are ostracized in society. You don't make it anywhere. And the subtle interaction here works better than the explicit. The Supreme Court's obsession with quid pro quo corruption is oblivious to this fact, because quid pro quo corruption is actually less effective than reciprocity corruption. If I say to you, I'll do this if you do that, it kind of insults the other person. But if you just give them a gift, and then the next time around you expect something in return, then that's the normal way humans interact. And of course, the reciprocity norm operates, again, subconsciously. You don't even know you're doing it. You're not even aware that that's the reason you think the return favor is a good idea. And then the dynamic they describe of moral license. All of us, this means that all of us have a certain leeway in the context of circumstances which are unclear. We have a leeway to behave, and that entails that we're going to behave unethically, but just up to a certain point. We're not going to become too unethical, but we're going to be a little bit unethical because we believe we got to get ours too, right? So there's a little bit of taking. As Dan Ariely puts it, people do cheat when they have the chance to do so, but they cheat only a little bit. The magnitude of dishonesty is not strictly monotonic in its relationship to the magnitude of the external rewards. People seem to know that they are overclaiming, but cheating by a little bit does not cause people to think of themselves as dishonest. They continue to think of themselves as honest even though they recognize they are cheating. Okay, take all of these aspects of behavioral ethics together, and here's the point, right? We have evolved from these creatures to that. The women are a little different, but you get the basic point. We've evolved to that through hundreds of thousands, millions of years of experience as these other creatures. The brain has developed in this context. And it is developed to embed certain strengths and certain weaknesses. And our capacity to act ethically in context of ethical question is not a function of logic, it's a function of the brains developed in exactly this way. And what we have to do when we think about institutions is we need to embrace the humility that recognition should suggest. We need to recognize how little ought can do. Not that it can do nothing, but that it can't do everything which it logically entails it ought to do. It can do only as much as the brain's processing it will allow it to do. So just as we can think back to the naive belief that an 18-year-old might have, that of course he can drink 3 beers and then go driving up Lakeshore Drive without any problem. Of course he can reason, he can think seriously and carefully as he's driving and not be influenced by the way in which that alcohol is processed in his body. What it means to grow up is to understand that's not true. It's just not true. We have limits as humans. And those limits tell us something about how we need to behave and what the institutions should be that we construct around us. There are limits to the human brain. And we need to build institutions that account for these limits, that recognize them and respect them, especially urgently now, before we sell the soul of the academy to influences we know we as academics cannot resist, to influences we can observe institutions within the academy are being bent by. It's not a matter of willing ourselves to resist them. We need to structure ourselves to avoid them. Okay, so how would we do that? This is where I should have had a drum roll. And then I say, stay tuned, because that's the subject of next week's lecture. Thank you very much. So there's a mic, there's a question. Let's put them together.
Thank you. Okay. Regarding the production of academic knowledge and professors' reliance on peer review in journals of prestige that bar access to the knowledge produced afterwards, I guess it's sort of the debate of open access. Could you speak a little bit about what professors' roles should be in going away from those kinds of journals, or should they try to work within them?
So it's a great question. I've not thought about that in the context of corruption, but I've thought about it a lot in the context of just what makes sense. You know, we developed a way of publishing that assumed something about the architecture of publishing. Namely, it was costly to produce journals and to send them out, and they had to be physically stored, and that was inexpensive. And in the context of that, we developed rules for access, and those rules presumptively gave the journals exclusive copyright over those works so that they can control and market them in a way that made it possible for them to bear the costs of that production. But as many have observed, we now have radically changed the technological platform for such production. And many journals are demonstrating it's no longer necessary to exercise control over the copy and distribution of the work in order to continue to do the sort of things that journals need to do. So the Public Library of Science produces highly rated journals. Public Library of Science's Journal of Medicine is like number 6, I think, in the rank of those similar journals. Lots of others that are like that. The rules they operate under, though, make it so that anybody forever can copy and distribute the scientific work. They have peer review just like every other journal does, but they've just structured it differently so that they don't need to control access to that kind of work. My view is we should not be restricting access to academic work unless there's a good reason, and the change of technology has removed the good reason, and that we should be doing everything we can to make our work accessible, because making it accessible serves the purpose, the Enlightenment purpose, of access to knowledge for everybody. And that's especially true when you think about people outside of rich American universities, for us, it doesn't matter. The University of this library can get you access to any published work anywhere, probably immediately. But if you're outside of the United States and you need to pay even a small price to get access to this work, that basically guarantees you don't get access to the work. So when you have research being done about malaria treatments published in journals that are proprietary journals, that basically guarantees that the people who can get it basically without any cost are exactly the people who don't need it because we don't get malaria here. And the people who need it because they get malaria can't get access to it because it's inaccessible. So I think there is I have said, I think there's a moral obligation of academics to push against that, to resist that. Especially academics with tenure who have no excuse to say, I need to be in the highest rated journal anymore. You should say, no, I'm only going to publish in journals, which is what I say, who guarantee me the right to make the work accessible. Now, who cares about law review articles? But, if you were a doctor, this could be quite significant, right? And so I've said that I think that's a standard academics should live up to, and the most obvious way to force all academics to live up to it would be if students started being activist about it, like going to professors and saying, why are you publishing in this place? Like, what's the justification for it? Because if you don't have a good justification for it, you should change. And I think, just a few of those kind of protests would pretty significantly change the way in which that project worked. Right there.
I was kind of surprised the way that you followed the psychological bent of how people justify doing that. I wasn't thinking of this. I was more focused just to be more of an empirical approach. And my question is this: when you were at Stanford, you couldn't help but notice all these buildings named after these Silicon Valley tech billionaire oligarchs. And so maybe you could address that. And my second question, were you aware of this recent Washington Post expose on funding to the Brookings Institute and how there might be influence? Could you address that within the context of your remarks?
Yeah, so it's, at Stanford, it's so hot, you never leave your own building, and we didn't have oligarchs funding the law school. So no, I didn't notice that very much. But I heard, there was like the Gates building and things like that. And so, there was that awareness, although how it operates at Stanford is a complicated story because they have a much more optimistic view about the ability of academics to maintain the right kind of distance. And I should say, I actually think this problem is field specific. So, MIT has lots of funding to develop technology or to develop certain kind of scientific advances. And the thing about the hard sciences is that it either works or it doesn't. There's no bullshitting your way to a different result. It's like, it's going to actually happen that you've moved the atom in that way, or you didn't, right? But if you think about something like economics, it's not the same. It's obvious, obviously we've just recently seen this with the economics around the global financial crisis. It's obviously easier to imagine economics being influenced in a way that might undermine your confidence in the underlying work. So I think that you might be worried about it more in a soft science field, like law and economics, than you would be in a really hard science field, which is why computer science, you might worry about the way in which it's steering development, but you wouldn't really worry so much about it producing falsity, because there's no falsity to be produced in that context. With respect to the think tanks, yes, in fact, one of our fellows was the woman who did the data work that established that all of these think tanks were receiving foreign money to do research that was pretty directly related to lobbying the federal government for certain policy outcomes, which of course is not legal. So she produced a huge database and then made that database available to others to look at, and the product of that was this New York Times article. And in the 4-hour version of this lecture, there's a whole chunk about think tanks, because I think think tanks are a beautiful example of the way in which this influence has undermined the integrity of at least many of them. I wouldn't say all of them, but this constant need to fund creates the incentive to create all sorts of interesting relationships with funding funders, and those relationships, the work that people have done at the Safra Center around think tanks has demonstrated, changes the direction of what the think tanks otherwise would be working on. You find that on liberal think tanks like Center for American Progress. You find that in conservative think tanks. It's not a political point. It's just a funding point. And so I think that's a perfect example of the kind of dynamic that this talk was trying to point to more generally. Right over here. So there's a mic coming to you.
I work for a publishing company that
The mic is off.
supposed to be up. I'll stand up. I work for a publishing company that's profit-oriented, and I can attest that the bad behavior of for-profit publishing companies in the academic realm, people I sell to people on college campuses, has really eroded the trust of people in us. It's hard for me sometimes to approach people. Partly because of the opportunity for these open resources. I think there's an argument to be made for for-profit publishing. We publish textbooks, we trade books and textbooks by excellent people. They're arguably really, really good textbooks. And arguably publishing is one of those, it's partially a gift economy. Everything we have comes from the academy, and then we put it back out, we shape it. But I have seen just recently people who look at me with extreme distrust because we have raised our prices, we've leveraged our channels to extract more money during the recession from people who were really hurting, and it's unquestionable, I think, that publishing should still exist, and people need to be paid for their work. So the gifting part is that the money we make from textbooks, arguably, even excellent textbooks, can go to publish fiction and poetry that might not otherwise be published. So I'm interested in whether you can talk about these sort of mixed gift, profit, open access sort of dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an absolute position that says that everything needs to be free, in the sense of license-free. I don't mean costless, but I mean license-freely. I have a more experimental position, which is we ought to be experimenting with lots of different types of models here. So I operate in a law school environment where law students pay hundreds of dollars for public domain books with public domain cases in them, and then 6 or 7 questions by clever law professors at the end of every case. Right now, of course, the professors, my colleagues, some of them make lots of money from this. Not as much as you would have thought, but they make lots of money. This is really important to them. And they would say, like you say, it's really important that people like us be paid for our hard work. And I can understand how being paid for your hard work creates exactly the kind of economy that we see with textbooks, where like the superstars get to create the textbooks. You must have a textbook, Doug, right? Superstars create the textbooks, and all of the kind of minions sort of take the textbook and follow from it. But at Harvard, we're experimenting with a project which we secretly refer to as the Destroy the Casebook Market project, where we publish electronic casebooks freely, and what this system does is enable law professors to begin to weave together their own version of the casebook. So, for example, if I'm teaching constitutional law and I'm going to teach the First Amendment's religion clauses, and I look at Michael McConnell's way of organizing the First Amendment religion clause cases, and I think they're great, except I would put this case in the middle of it, I can do my own playlist. And then I can publish Lessig's playlist of this on the net. And then other people can look at my playlist and compare it to Michael McConnell's playlist. Oh, and say, I see, that's interesting. You do that like that. I see why you're doing that. I'm going to use Lessig's playlist. And then Lessig's playlist becomes, popular, obviously. And what that does is it's encouraging I'm imagining I'm a young professor, but imagine I were a young professor. It would be encouraging young professors to be thinking creatively about how to construct casebooks in a way which rewarded them because other people could notice how they've constructed casebooks and begin to think of them as people insightful about the subject matter because they see the way they've organized the material and it's much more insightful than the way other people. So the point is that's created an opportunity for a kind of creative expression that doesn't exist in the market where there's a single superstar who publish, or 6 superstars who publish the casebook, and then I just Xerox different cases and stuff them in as I'm teaching the course. So that's a different way of publishing. It requires, though, freely being able, be able to access this work freely. And I, pretty confident that you're going to see much more innovation in the way casebook stuff is presented under my model than under the old model, but let's see. Let's see. That's the only point. Way in the back.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could, your argument focused a lot on the sciences and maybe related social sciences, and I was wondering if you could extend it even more explicitly towards the humanities. And in conjunction with that, I guess I was thinking about your opening slide recapping the earlier lecture. And if you simply replaced, instead of Congress, the Academy, the sentence pretty much still works about being beholden to funders. And so it strikes me particularly maybe in the humanities that the types of things that we would be beholden to are external funders. And then one thing that is different from your argument, it's not exactly about the public trust, maybe that's part of it, but it's also, there's kind of internal institutional corruption. So you have a kind of people kind of regulating their own actions. And I guess my question is, I don't know, you think about Elihu Yale, who made part of his money renting his ships out to the slave trade, or Cecil Rhodes in Southern Africa. Do we have how should we think about where the money is coming from? And then how should we think about how we interact with each other in terms of what we do with the money? And is there a way that the corruption really is now internal to the profession itself, even beyond the kind of market forces that you're talking about?
So, yes and no. So, I personally have no problem with institutions like universities providing a kind of reputation laundering service to people who've made money. I mean, there's limits. I wouldn't, if there were a slave trader today who, came and said, I've made this off a sex trade and I'd like to give you $1 billion, I would hope a university would say no. But, if it's a legal enterprise, even if it's not something you like very much, and they want to come and be remembered as, some great figure, I'm okay with that. I had this experience of writing a letter to Gerald Cassidy. So Gerald Cassidy is the lobbyist who invented earmarks. Incredibly wealthy man, used to be a McGovern Democrat, but now who knows what he is, but he's a hugely powerful lobbyist in Washington. And I said to him, I wrote him a letter and I sent him a portrait of Alfred Nobel. And he wrote me and he called me and said, why did you do this? And I said, you should think about Alfred Nobel. And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know Alfred Nobel's story, right? And he said, no. And he said, well, Alfred Nobel read his own obituary because Alfred Nobel's brother died, but they thought it was Alfred Nobel, and they published Alfred Nobel's obituary. And the obituary told the story about the inventor of dynamite, and how his life had all been about, these destructive weapons. And he thought to himself, this is not how I want to be remembered. And so he created the Nobel Peace Prize. And so that's how we think about Alfred Nobel, right? So he washed his reputation by this gift in that way. And I said to Cassidy, help us save democracy. Then we'll remember you as the guy who saved democracy, not the guy who ruined democracy. But he laughed. He said, no way. But I can imagine, I have no problem with that for an institution, again, within certain range. But I can understand the position who said, no, you should not take any money you would not, want your daughter to earn in that way. Okay, I get that. But that's not my position. The position I'm worried about is taking money in contexts where it's completely obvious the way in which it will affect the academic mission. So, for example, one of our researchers is doing work about food science. Penn State University has a center funded by the Hershey's Corporation. So what does a nutrition study do inside of a center funded by the Hershey's Corporation? Now, you can have all sorts of formal rules, and I can actually believe that in certain contexts those rules work. I don't know if this is the same way it is at the law school today, but when I was at the law school, you would get summer money to write articles. You would write those articles. You would turn them into the dean. The dean would say, that's great, or sometimes they would say, that's crap, but hopefully he'd say, that's great. And now I'd like you to put it in your first footnote, thank you to so-and-so for the funding of this research. Now, technically, the funder had nothing to do with the articles. You didn't even know who the funder was until after you were finished and turning it in. That rule structure was a perfectly designed rule structure to facilitate getting grants, but not affecting the research. But if it were the other way around, you had to come and say, I'm going to do work about the nutritional value of chocolate, so give me the money from the Hershey's Corporation, then I begin to worry about the way in which it's corrupting or bending the research. So it's possible to structure these things in ways that I think neutralize the corrupting influence. And there are institutions that can afford to do it easily. So Chicago, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, these are institutions that can afford to do the right thing. If you want to give money to Harvard, it is incredibly difficult because there are all sorts of things you've got to affirm and demonstrate to make sure that you're not improperly influencing the way research is done at Harvard. The problem is that not every institution is like Harvard, Yale, and Chicago. They all can't afford it. Not all of them are as wealthy or as insulated from that kind of influence. And so part of the reason to develop something called institutional corruption as a way to think about this problem is to give resources to people in those institutions to talk about why it's problematic that you've accepted money in the following way. To give them a way to think about what's the problem with this. Jennifer Washburn at the end of her book has this really wonderful plea, which is we just need to create a counterbalance so that there's a conversation to be had. And I think that's not everything, but it's a lot. People, Google has this slogan, do no evil or something like that. I don't know what it is, something like that. And people say, this is so stupid, that's going to really do anything. But I remember somebody, one student in my class saying, well, just think about what it's like to be an engineer at Google versus an engineer at, he said a particular company, but I'm not going to pick on that company. And if you're an engineer at Google and they say, do this, you can at least point to the thing on the wall that says, do no evil, and then begin to have a conversation about whether this is evil or not. But he said at this other company, there's nothing to point to on the wall. There's just what's our stock price today, right? So I think, these small resources are resources to help people focus on what the right thing to do is for an institution. And what I've tried to suggest here is the institution needs to recognize that it has to care for the particular weakness. It has to understand the particular weakness, understand the humility we've got to have about the weakness of individuals within those institutions to do what we all think is the right thing under the ongoing pressure of being a researcher or a scholar or an academic in these contexts. I'm told one more question. So who has the best question here? I think you do in the back, right? The woman right here, she has the best question. Yep. Yep.
Well, I used to be an adjunct professor. So I wanted to ask you about how you would relate corruption in the academy. You talked about it from an intellectual perspective, but how would you relate it to the university's educational role? And higher education in the broader sphere. So, like for example, in city colleges, we now have this phenomenon where administrators outnumber full-time professors 3 to 1. And we have a number of mid-tier institutions that are encouraging people to get PhDs, even though the opportunities are becoming quite limited because full-time positions are being cut. We also have this situation where tuition is climbing so high because U.S. News rankings linked it to the amount of money spent per student, and now we feel that every university has to have its own climbing wall. And then there's the issue of access. If you have a robust fundraising apparatus at your institution, which the University of Chicago does, and many of the corruption issues are not as bad here as they are in other places. But if you don't have that apparatus and you're a public university and your government funding is getting cut, access to higher education is being cut at a time when most Americans need it more than ever before. So to what extent is that dependent on the influence of private companies, and to what extent is it dependent on the influence of government loans, which can seem like, oh, we can just take a loan and pay it back later, or is it both? How would you frame that within your larger discussion?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, but a really hard question. I've got to say that I'm talking about one tiny corner of it, but I think it intersects in one particular way. But I want to say that the intersection and the part I want to talk about is about 2% of the problem you've described. But the way in which it might intersect is you pointed to the student loan phenomenon. There's a particular way in which, of course, the market has been affected by the student loan, or you could say, the economists would say the market has been distorted by the student loan phenomenon, which is basically these are loans that you can't get out of. You can't declare bankruptcy on a student loan. There's a bankruptcy professor here. I hope he's going to confirm me, but you can't declare bankruptcy on a student loan, which means that in a certain sense, loans that are given to students are a preferred kind of loan for the person making the loan relative to others because, you know, young people are going to be around for a long time. You can continue to collect for them for their whole life to pay off the loan. They can't declare bankruptcy. They can't get out of it. So it's a particularly lucrative market, which is part of the reason why the government, the Obama administration was eager to find a way to pull it back from the market because this seemed to be an unnecessary subsidy to the market. But they haven't changed the basic dynamic of this. They continue to have this as the same dynamic. So why is it they've done it like that? Well, you've heard this story from me. If you've been to more than one of these lectures again and again, there's a certain rent-seeking influence, lobbying influence that produced that change in the law that created that particular benefit, that made it so that there was this default way of funding, which was loans, which made it so people leave college now with these huge loans, which if that change had not been made, there would have been a different way in which things would be funded. Now, some people would say, well, fewer people could go to college. Maybe that's true. I mean, I'm not sure. But the point is that the distortion was imposed because of the way in which the influence in the political system operated to create this special benefit. And the reality is, of course, that this is one of the biggest problems of debt that there is for our society. Creates exactly the wrong incentives for kids, because what you want kids to do when they leave college is to experiment with about 4 or 5 different things that they might want to do, and then to figure out what the thing is they want to do. But you've got a debt burden that forces them to lock themselves in as quickly as they can to a particular thing so that they can pay back the debt. And of course, the cost of what they're paying back is radically greater than what my parents or even people a little bit older than I faced. I still remember when I went to college, we were just at the cusp of the time where you could work in the summer and earn enough money to pay for college. Now you can work in the summer and maybe earn enough money to pay living expenses for one term if you're lucky, right? You can't begin to pay for college. So this is a guaranteed debt structure. That I think has ballooned out of all proportion and is one of the biggest problems for us to solve. But all of it is not solved or described by the particular corner that I've pointed to, and I don't think I know enough to be able to talk beyond that. And I also don't have any time, fortunately, so I'm going to stop. Thank you so much for